morning. Here we go. Welcome, everyone. We're so excited to have you all here tonight. My name is Dr. Erin Leaf, and I'm a senior lecturer and the associate head of school for the School of Educational Psychology and Counseling here in the Faculty of Education. That's me. So I would like to begin today by acknowledging the people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet today and Monash campus sits, and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. And I also extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be here today. And I extend that same respect to the traditional custodians of the lands where all of you joining us online are coming from this evening. And I would also like to acknowledge that there's still much work to do to ensure and explore how we can deliver better educational and well-being supports and programs to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students in ways that are culturally safe and responsive. And so I hope that some of the conversations we have today can spark further discussion about ways to include the voices and choices of Aboriginal people in our professional work and in our research. So again, on behalf of the School of Educational Psychology and Counseling here at Monash, welcome to everybody that is joining us online. For those of you joining us online, we would love to hear from you. So please feel free to put any hellos, any questions, any comments in the comments on, I think it's a YouTube live stream. And also please chat with us through the Slido polls that will be opening throughout the presentation. Tonight we will begin with our keynote, which I will introduce in just a minute, and then we will follow that with a panel discussion. And hopefully through the panel discussion, we'll have more of an opportunity to get all of you involved and take your questions. What more do you want to know about how schools can and should support the well-being of students? And how do we do this work in today's busy schools where there's a lot of competing priorities and pressures on teachers? If you are joining us online, please do put your questions in the comments. We'll open a second Slido later in the presentation for you to upvote questions that other people have provided that you think you'd really like to hear the answer to. And if you're on Twitter, we also encourage you to tweet through our presentation, and you can use the tag @Monash Education. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Tonight, we are so fortunate to have our 2024 Distinguished Visiting Scholar, Professor Neil Humphrey from the University of Manchester in the UK. And he's here to talk to us tonight about student well-being. And so through this presentation, Neil will highlight and discuss the idea of well-being. What is well-being? Why should we care about well-being? And what are some of the challenges that students face today with respect to well-being, and how does that impact their learning? Neil will discuss school-based responses that can promote student well-being and really pay attention to how we integrate this into the curriculum. Neil, again, is our visiting scholar who we are so fortunate to have here, and he loves the weather. It's so warm and not like the UK. Neil is the Sarah Feldon Chair in Psychology of Education at the University of Manchester and a former research coordinator and head of the Manchester Institute of Education. His research focuses on what we mean by mental health, why mental health matters, and what matters for mental health, and what works for mental health in children and young people. And his work has been funded by the National Institute for Health Research, the National Lottery Community Fund, and the Education Endowment Foundation. So now I will turn it over to Neil Humphrey. So please join me in giving him a big welcome.
Thank you. Okay. Hi, everyone. Can everybody... Oh, do we do that or no?
Everyone, if you're online, go ahead and join our Slido poll.
So I'll leave that up for a second. So I'm Neil. There we go. I recognise that slide, so I'll start there. So as Erin said, so I'm Neil Humphrey. It's wonderful to be here, and I want to thank and acknowledge again the colleagues that invited me and everybody that's made me feel so welcome in the few days that I've been here. Had a fantastic experience so far. Great discussions with colleagues, and just a wonderful city, and an amazing kind of vibe. The feeling that you get when you arrive in Melbourne is fantastic. So I'm going to talk about this idea of the promotion of wellbeing in schools, and the idea of a kind of a public health crisis in terms of children and young people's mental health. I want to start though, I've flown all the way around the world. I can't start without telling you a little bit about where I've come from. So Manchester is my hometown. The bee is very important in Manchester. So the worker bee is the symbol of the city of Manchester. It was originally designed to represent the industrious nature of the people, because of course the Industrial Revolution and all those things started in Manchester. It's been reborn as a symbol of resilience since 2017, since the bombing. And there's a poem which I would encourage you, it's called "This is the Place." Everything that you need to know about Manchester is in that poem, about why people that live there, like myself, think it's the most wonderful city on the planet. So my favourite quote, though, about Manchester, which is, I think, what epitomises the kind of city it is. So there's a broadcaster called Mark Radcliffe, who's local to Manchester, who talks about it being the city that thinks tables are for dancing on. So it gives you a sense of the kind of fun and the kind of welcoming nature of cities like Manchester in the north of England that are, the people make the city, and Manchester's wonderful in that respect. So, a little bit of an overview. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we mean by well-being, follow that up by trying to convince you, if you're not already convinced, about why well-being and mental health matters, what matters for well-being, what works for well-being, and then we'll get to the panel and we'll have a nice discussion. Sound good? Okay, awesome. So in terms of that question of what we mean by well-being, it depends who you ask and who you read. So I'm going to give you various kind of ways of thinking about well-being. The one that I really like, my colleague Jess Dayton, who I do a lot of work with, who's at UCL and the Anna Freud Centre, keeps it really simple. Well-being is about feeling good and functioning well. If you want the kind of more academic perspective, we've got the kind of theoretical models of well-being. So there's the hedonic model, which is about feeling and thinking, so positive affect, but also that sense of satisfaction, overall happiness with life. The eudaimonic perspective of well-being, which is that well-being is about the meaning that things give our lives, and the idea of flourishing and thriving. And then the complete state model, so Key's model, which is about balance, about kind of the balance between feeling sometimes distressed, but also being able to have that equilibrium with the kind of sense of overall happiness and well-being. They're all different overlapping perspectives, but the reason that I'm putting them up here at the outset is because the research I'm going to talk you through tonight, you'll see different perspectives embedded in that. Some of it will focus on, I'll use the word mental health, others will focus on well-being, others will talk about life satisfaction. So there's not one right answer in terms of this question. And we do talk also about objective and subjective well-being. Almost all of my work is about subjective well-being, about asking young people how they feel about their lives. The objective stuff is, what's the likelihood that you die by the age of 5 in different countries in the world? Those are the objective, those kinds of things are, child mortality is a really good objective marker of well-being, but my work is much more on the subjective side. And in one of our latest projects, we've gone to the main source of our inspiration, which is young people, and we spoke to young people in the Be Well project, which I'll say a little bit about later on, and asked them. So we did focus groups with young people. What does the term well-being mean to you? And then they gave us their responses, and we kind of helped them pull together essentially kind of 3 elements. So young people talked about feeling of meaning, purpose, and control over their lives, understanding themselves, so a kind of an introspective kind of element of well-being, but also that really important element of emotional experience, the positive and the negative emotions. One of the questions that kind of comes up frequently in the UK, and I'm guessing internationally now as well, is has young people's well-being got worse over time? So I'm not going to dwell on all of these, but just to give you a few examples, what the data is telling us. So even pre-pandemic, so starting with this one over on the left, so this is children's life satisfaction in England from 2009 up until 2020. So it starts sort of 15 years ago and runs right the way up to the pandemic. So even pre-pandemic, you can see the trend in England is children's life satisfaction decreasing year on year. Big national study looking at, in the middle there, looking at probable diagnoses or probable mental disorder. And they're actually a slightly different picture. So depending on the nature of the mental health difficulties, so externalizing problems, those kind of behavioral conduct problems, pretty stable over time, but a significant rise in what we would call internalizing difficulties. So those difficulties that are characterized by feelings of sadness and low mood and worry. We had, in the pandemic, the opportunity to do a little bit of a natural experiment. So we were collecting data for a trial that we were running on, ironically enough, mental health interventions in schools. And the pandemic kind of blew that out of the water because all the schools closed down. But two of our postdocs, two fantastic postdocs, had an idea. They said, well, hang on, the disruption that's happened, if we can get data after all this is over, we've got this natural experiment. So we had children that we'd recruited to the trial pre-COVID, and they'd taken the baseline measures in the trial, and then we'd done a one-year follow-up. And then we had kids that had done the baseline in the second wave of recruitment, and then the pandemic happened. When schools went back again, we were able to get the follow-up data for those kids. So we've got this natural experiment that helps us estimate what the impact of the pandemic is on children and young people's mental health. So Rosie and João, who led this paper, brilliant piece of work, 6% increase in severe depression among young people. That's really quite a significant shift in the prevalence of that particular mental health condition over essentially a one-year period. So a really concerning shift that we're still, I think, seeing the effects of even now, even several years later. One kind of reason for hope, though, is one of the things we do in our Be Well project is we look at the difficulties children are experiencing, but we also look at things like hope and optimism. And what we've seen is that bounce back as we look at the year-on-year data. So it tanked the year of the pandemic. So there was about a 10 or 11% drop in the proportion of young children who were reporting feel hopeful and optimistic about the future. This year, our most recent survey is back to pre-pandemic levels. So there are signs the kind of green shoots of recovery are there, as well as the things that still concern us. Why does all this matter? Why should we be interested? It matters because it matters, okay? We do too much in education trying to connect things to academic attainment, okay? That's the currency by which we make things matter. Oh, well, does it impact children's learning? My argument is, well, yes, it does. The evidence suggests that well-being really does actually impact children's learning, but it shouldn't actually matter. It should be important in and of its own right. You can take it from a rights perspective and say, you know, children have a right to grow up happy and satisfied with their lives and feeling fulfilled and flourishing. It shouldn't have to be connected to academic attainment for it to be something that we care about. But if you do need convincing, this is a recent economic report looking at the cost of mental health problems in the UK. We lose about £117 billion per annum, about 5% of UK GDP lost directly attributable to the effects of mental health problems. A lot of that is lost economic productivity. So people that are struggling with their mental health are less likely to be in work, but even if they're in work, they're less happy and less productive. The fourth highest cause of what we call disability-adjusted life years, the second highest years lived with a disability. It's a major, major societal problem. And why it matters in childhood, there's some really nice longitudinal research that shows mental health difficulties and well-being in childhood predict physical and mental health in adulthood. It predicts employment outcomes in adulthood, and it predicts all kinds of additional societal costs to do with things like accessing health services, criminal justice system, and so on. So even if you don't think it matters in and of itself, it matters in all these other ways that affect our society. So what matters for well-being if we're convinced that well-being matters? So I'm just going to, again, a few things that we found in some of our recent studies. So I'll start with the left-hand side, which, apologies, the text is probably too small to read. But these are different characteristics. So we've got gender identity on there. So we've got young people who are trans and gender diverse. We've got sexuality, migration status, so young people that have been born elsewhere and moved to the UK, ethnicity, special educational needs, socioeconomic deprivation, age. All of this is data from our recent Be Well study that we've been doing. And what the different visual indicators show, these are odds ratios. So the line in the middle is basically equal odds. And then you can see the kids who are more at risk of low well-being, anyone on the left-hand side of the chart. So the kids who are trans and gender diverse, for example, much lower levels of well-being than their cisgender peers. The kids who are the kind of sexual minority young people, the lesbian, gay, bi, pansexual, much worse well-being than their peers. Kids with special educational needs, kids from poorer background, and kids as they get older, their well-being gets worse. We've done a few studies using the Be Well data and looking at, so these are characteristics. The characteristics themselves don't cause the mental health difficulties. They are proxies for experiences that children have because of the way that they are and because of the way other people are towards them in terms of things like discrimination and bullying and so on. So we looked at bullying as an example to try and estimate the impact of bullying on children's mental health difficulties. Kids who are bullied, depending on where you draw the line as to where bullying starts, like whether you're bullied or not bullied, depending on where you draw that line, anywhere from 3.5 to over 4 times more likely to have significant mental health difficulties than kids that are not bullied. And we do this thing called population attributable fraction. So it's an estimate of, if you've got a proportion of the population that's experiencing mental health difficulties, within that, what's the proportion that's attributable to a particular risk factor, in this case, bullying. And it's about 20%. So about 1 in 5 young people who have mental health difficulties, those difficulties are at least in part attributable to them being victims of bullying. I highlight bullying because it's one of the most tractable, it's one of the things that we can really do something about in schools. If we use the evidence base and get it right, it's a really strong lever that we can use to move the needle in terms of young people's mental health. Other things, though, that we've looked at, participation in arts, culture and entertainment. So we've just published this study looking at what young people do in their free time. So when they're not in school, are they playing sports? Are they playing music? Are they all the different things young people could do? And we did this analysis, something called latent class analysis, that builds profiles of young people who have similar patterns of behavior, classify them, and then we look at, does membership of particular latent classes, does it predict their later well-being? And we had 2 particular classes, 2 profiles of young people that I'm going to highlight, what we call the dynamic doers. So these are kids who have good, varied access to arts, culture, entertainment and sports. And then the activity-free adolescents. So this is about 1 in 5 young people in our data set who are really quite disengaged and unable to access that. About 10 percentile point difference in their later well-being. After controlling for their prior well-being, after controlling for all kinds of social demographic characteristics, these kinds of enriching activities that we just think are the kind of fun things that we do when we're not in school make a real difference to young people's well-being. Other things, which I won't dwell on just in the interest of time, but neighbourhoods make a difference. Where young people live makes a difference. Place is really important. The relational elements of neighbourhoods, how much trust young people think they have in others around them, how safe they feel in their neighbourhood is a really key driver. Last thing I'll highlight, though, because it's quite often controversial, because people assume it's a really bad thing. We did an analysis recently that my colleague Margarita Panayiotou led, longitudinal analysis looking at social media use. Pretty much everybody's expectation is the more you use social media, the worse your mental health if you're a young person. Would that be an accurate kind of estimate? Yeah, a lot of people kind of nod along. We found it's one of the least influential factors in a really rigorous analysis, longitudinal, using something called Understanding Society data set. It's among the least influential factors. What we found in that analysis was, again, bullying, but also family dysfunction and dissatisfaction with schools. So if we're looking for factors that we need to adapt to make a difference to young people's well-being, we need to stop obsessing about social media use. That's not to say it's not harmful for some young people, but actually there are much more powerful drivers of well-being out there than how much time kids spend on social media. And to finish this bit with just a little longitudinal analysis that we've been doing, just to get a sense of the process that might be happening. So we talk about different risk factors that kids are exposed to, whether it's bullying, social, kind of poverty, all the things that might kind of directly or indirectly harm their mental health. So we had an analysis where we looked at, cumulative risk exposure, and then a couple of years later, did that predict emotional distress, sadness, anxiety, worry, those kinds of things? Yes, it did. Did it predict it after we control for prior mental health, ethnicity? Yes, it did. Was that relationship kind of mediated or explained by how much stress it caused the young people? Yes, it was. All of that is consistent with the kind of theoretical models of how mental health problems develop in young people. But what was really interesting about this was, if I can click on, why is it not working? Am I pointing in the right direction? Oh, no, there we go, we got it. How support from other kids and support from family adults actually moderated that relationship. So what that means is cumulative risk exposure to bullying and deprivation, things like that, increases stress levels. But the strength of that relationship is moderated by how much support kids perceive from other kids around them and how much support they perceive. So with equal amounts of risk exposure, the kids who have good support from their friends and good support from adults in their lives feel less stressed as a result, the kids that don't have that support. So again, a really tractable a thing that we can use and intervene to shift and interrupt that process. In terms of what works for well-being, I like the analogy of, children are growing, developing the kind of how you would nurture a plant in your garden. So we can provide a nurturing environment. We can provide foundations that are rich in kind of love and care and kids feeling safe. We can assess and monitor in the same way that, if you've got a sapling, you would keep an eye on it and make sure that it's growing and that it's well kind of supported and so on. If it needed additional support, we can provide that. But also sometimes you might need to replant, you might need to refer, and we need to know, particularly schools, because there's so much responsibility placed on schools these days around mental health. Actually, they get to a point where the best thing you can do is refer on to more specialist services, and we need to know more about when we can do that and when it's appropriate to do that. And all that needs to be built into a kind of a whole school integrated model. It's no good if we do the assessment and monitoring, but we're not doing the nurturing, support and referral. It's parts of the jigsaw puzzle that are missing. I'm going to say a little bit, I mentioned about our project Be Well, but this is on the kind of assessment and monitoring side of things. So this is a project that we've been doing for 3 years in Greater Manchester, and we've just extended it to the south of England. We've surveyed now, this is the backbone of it, is annual surveys of young people's well-being, the drives of their well-being, in schools, in our city region and also down south. We've surveyed now about 85,000 young people across nearly 300 schools. With that data, we write our fancy academic papers, okay, because we like part and parcel of being an academic, we write papers in journals that nobody reads, but we also make much better use of the data by feeding it back to schools and other people who have a role in supporting young people's well-being through dashboards, themed analyses, communities of practice, all kinds of different dissemination events. The idea being that schools then have got an evidence base on which to kind of base their decision making around the things that they need to shift in their provision, things we could do more of, less of, try something different. They've suddenly got this rich evidence base to help them make those kinds of decisions. We've been doing this for 3 years in Greater Manchester, and our estimate now is based on the data that we've produced and based solely on initiatives that we can actually cost, and most of the things I would say that have happened as a result of this process happening, you can't really put a figure on, but of those that we can, over £1 million drawn back into the system. So the data acts like a magnet for resources because we've now got an evidence base about which parts of Greater Manchester need more resource because there's more vulnerable children that, or which, where can we place resources to try and tackle loneliness, which is a major issue in both young people and adults as a result of the pandemic. So we need the assessment and monitoring. If you want to find out more, we've got a website, Google Be Well, or go to bewellprogram.org. And I want to give you a few examples just to finish with of the kinds of programs and the kinds of approaches that we found in the UK and that our team has done research on that have been successful. Starting with an example, social emotional learning. spoke about a few colleagues in the room that I had a talk yesterday about social emotional learning in schools, and one of the interventions I highlighted there, something called Inclusive Learning Together that a colleague of ours down in London developed, and it blends kind of bullying prevention through restorative practice with a social emotional learning curriculum. The idea being that if you want to combat bullying, you need to build skills in relation to kind of empathy, but you also need to have that kind of restorative approach so that young people understand the consequences of their actions and are able to make amends. Randomised trial involving 40 schools. Colleagues down in London focused on the bullying outcomes, found it reduced bullying. We were tasked with actually looking at, well, if you do that and if you change the climate of a school, is that actually going to drive up their academic attainment? So again, in one sense, it doesn't matter if it does, because like I said, it matters. Wellbeing matters because it matters. But as an interesting research question, does it improve academic attainment? And we actually found that it did. So the kids who were in the intervention schools, compared to their peers, they do their end of school assessments 2 years after this intervention is complete, and we find additional 2 months of academic progress in the kids in the intervention arm. So this is not something designed directly to improve attainment, but it's doing it via the fact that it's changing the culture and the climate of the school to be somewhere where children feel safer, and a child that feels safe is more ready to learn. Another example, so that's a universal intervention, that's for all kids. We also have an example of an intervention, something called Bounce Back. This is primary schools, kids who have emergent mental health difficulties. They do small group work, so there's a youth practitioner who works with them in small groups, thinking through basically what are their needs and how can they be met. So it might be basic needs like, am I getting enough sleep? It might be their belonging needs, about our need to kind of develop and maintain good relationships with other people. It might be their learning needs. It might be their coping needs, core self. Things like how do we remain hopeful and optimistic even when life is really quite challenging. So they work through that process with a youth practitioner in small groups in a safe space, and they can think about strategies that help them cope with difficult situations, all that kind of stuff. We did a randomised trial of it, over 300 children, and we found the main outcome we were interested in was kids' emotional symptoms, the kind of sadness, anxiety, worry, because again, coming back to the data that we've got on where things are getting worse, that's one of the areas where we're seeing a real strong rise in prevalence, particularly into adolescence. So we found that not only did it reduce kids' internalising symptoms, and we did our main analysis, when we then did a follow-up analysis that factors in it something called CASE, Complier Average Causal Effect Estimation. It's a way of estimating intervention effects that take account of the fact that when you run an intervention, some kids are going to go to more sessions than others, and that might make a difference to outcomes. And what you can see there is, so the main effect is the one on the left. When we look at kids who've attended most of the sessions, it grows. And when we look at kids who basically attended all or all but one of the sessions, you get even better outcomes. So that tells us two things. First of all is that this is a program that's got great promise and can be useful for kids who've got emergent difficulties, but also it's something that we can then focus on future iterations of that. If we know that those higher levels of attendance really matter and can trigger change, then we need to think about, well, how can we encourage, how can we support kids to feel able to go to these? And one of the things that we found in terms of what predicted attendance was there were disparities in ethnicity. Kids from minority groups were less likely to go to the kind of full range of the sessions. So again, an important lesson for us about, okay, is there something for kids from minority ethnic backgrounds that's making this feel less appealing and accessible for them than it is for their white peers? So again, something though that we can directly act on. Go and talk to the kids. Go and find out for those kids, why was it that they went to the first few sessions and then stopped attending. We can get rich insights if we just ask young people. A third example I want to give you, this is probably, if you know anything about, if you're anywhere familiar with social emotional learning, one of the most, I suppose, long-lasting SEL interventions. So this has been around in the States since, it must be the mid-1980s it was originally developed. So a chap called Mark Greenberg, who was at Penn State University, developed this with Carol Couchet. Excuse me. It was in the States for a number of years, and then gradually it started to be, adopted in other parts of the world. Came to England, we did a randomized trial of it. Actually, fairly mixed results in some senses, but there's some interesting findings in relation to wellbeing. So this is primary schools, it's universal, so it's for all kids, it's taught by the classroom teacher. Randomized trial, 45 schools, over 5,000 children. I'll talk about the economic benefits in a second, but again, I just want to show you the importance, in this case, of implementation. So 3 outcomes that we focused on: kids' mental well-being, perceptions of peer support, and feelings of connection to school. And the chart on the left is the main results. This is without accounting for how well the intervention was implemented. And what you can see there is there's a small effect on kids' mental well-being. So there's a small improvement overall as a result of taking part in the program, but no apparent effect on social support, school connection. When we do that case analysis that I mentioned, where we can factor in things like sessions attended or how well it was delivered, those kinds of things, the effect on mental well-being grows, and we suddenly get these positive effects on peer social support and school connection. So an intervention that can improve mental health, but it can really improve mental health and how connected kids feel to school and to each other if it's delivered well. So I was speaking to colleagues yesterday about this trend that you sometimes see in schools where we've got this intervention, we've got the materials, a poster goes up, there, we've done tick, we're doing that now, because we put the poster up or because the materials arrived in the post. That's not enough. It's got to be something that becomes not just delivered, but integrated and embedded. This can't be something that's just done on a Friday afternoon. It's got to be something that's part of that kind of whole school approach, and it becomes part of the daily practice of schools. Final example I'm going to give you, which really, I did mention the economic analysis, sorry. We did an economic analysis. So one of the ways in which I think we're going to have to go as the evidence base grows, we've got plenty of evidence now in terms of like what works. There's lots and lots of trials out there that tell us this intervention is really effective, this one not so much, and so on. So where we need to start going and where there's not nearly enough research is on that idea of cost effectiveness. It might be effective, but is it worth the human and financial resource that's required to produce that effect, particularly if it's kind of fairly small effects. So in the past trial, we did an economic analysis. I say we, not me. I have no clue. I'm not an economist, but I know a really good one. And so he did this cost effectiveness analysis, and it's in the way that he explained it to me, which I'm going to now pass on to you. If there's any economists in the room, please tell me if I'm wrong. But basically, it's ultimately about working out, to deliver this intervention, there are some basic costs associated with it. Like if it's something like PATHS, you have to pay for the materials, you have to pay for the training, but then there's also costs associated with the time it takes to deliver it and what you could have been delivering instead, all those kinds of things. So you work out that kind of, essentially the cost per pupil of delivering the intervention, and then if you've measured the right kind of outcomes, you can essentially monetize the well-being benefits, and then you can work out basically what's the probability that this is actually giving us greater gains than it's costing us. And in PATHS, in most of the analyses, there was a high probability of cost effectiveness. So you don't need, and this is all based, on this analysis, so you don't need massive shifts in mental health for these universal interventions to be, from an economic perspective, cost effective. So we need more of those kinds of analyses that help us discern, there's lots of interventions out there that are effective, but which ones really give you your bang for buck? Particularly if you think from a school's perspective, scarce resources, we need to be making really well-informed decisions about which of these different things to go for, and we need that kind of economic evidence. The final example that I want to give you is something really exciting about. This is literally hot off the press. We've been working with an organisation called Football Beyond Borders. So they have a really innovative, it's a targeted intervention for kids, not just for at-risk kids, because they also work with kids who are kind of passive learners and kids who are role models, but it's primarily designed to support the kids. If you can imagine in a secondary school, kids that get to about the age of 13, 14, generally that's an age when lots of kids start to become really disengaged with and disenfranchised from education. So these are the kids who are, really at risk in terms of exclusion, really at risk in terms of just being completely disenfranchised with education. If those kids like football, which lots and lots of kids, soccer, okay, just because I was told off about this the other day, I said football, and you mean soccer, yeah. I mean football, you call it soccer. If they love soccer, which lots of young people, not all young people, so this isn't for everybody, but many, many, many young people, it's our national sport by far and away. We're not very good at it, but that's a different story. It takes that passion for football, combines it with building a relationship with a trusted adult, so they're working with a kind of a youth practitioner, combines that with building ways of kind of building really strong peer support networks, helping young people to be the best resource for each other, and combines it with an activity, with something that we know is a really powerful driver of positive mental health, which is physical activity. You know, if I had to pick the one thing that anyone in this room could do to almost instantly get benefits to their mental health, is go and get sweaty somewhere. Now, interpret that how you will. Right, there's lots of different ways you could get sweat, but you know, physical activity has been proven time and again to be really powerfully positive for our mental health. And it combines all those things with an SEL curriculum. So these young people are exposed to all those different things that we know separately are really good for our well-being, and it pulls it together in this great package. We used our Be Well data. So they had data. The problem they came to us with, they had data on the well-being of the kids that had taken part in the program, but they didn't have a comparison group. They didn't have the kind of so what question of, well, what if they'd not had the intervention? So we use something called propensity score matching. So we've got this big Be Well data set. They share their data with us. We can match up. We can basically find for every child in their data set, we can match them using something called propensity score matching to a child in our Be Well data set that has very similar characteristics, very similar starting levels of well-being, and that then becomes our kind of natural control group. So we do that, and then when you've done that, you do your normal analysis, and we find this intervention, not only does it improve well-being, it improves well-being really quite powerfully. So it's about a 17 percentile point increase in young people's well-being compared to very similar kids who hadn't been part of the intervention. The super exciting part of it, though, is, again, I think the kind of the economic benefits. So we worked with an organization called Pro Bono Economics. First thing we do is we have to change. So the mental well-being measure that we use, you can't directly do the economic analysis on that. But we're able to estimate, based on our data, what the improvement in mental well-being equates to in terms of changes in life satisfaction. We use something called the ONS life satisfaction measure. And it equates to about a 0.6 on, this is on a 10-point scale from like completely dissatisfied with my life to 100% satisfied. It's about a 0.6 scale, so sort of 2/3 of a point's improvement. To put that in context, because that sounds, maybe it's quite small, but to put that in context, Pro Bono Economics, they've done work looking at adults who go from being unemployed to being employed. It's about the same improvement in satisfaction with life that those adults experience when they go from not having a job to having a job. It's the same kind of change. So they then take that and life satisfaction change, using that measure, you can build something called well-being years, which you can monetize. They use that to do this kind of return on investment. And the most conservative estimate, because economists love uncertainty, so they always do a range of different scenarios. The most conservative estimate is that for every pound spent implementing Football Beyond Borders, there are £2.20 return. So more than double your investment in well-being benefits, basically. It made the national press in The Guardian week before last. It's something that we're really excited about. This isn't the definitive study, so our key thing now is taking this kind of information and then going and looking at, well, actually, you know, doing a thorough explanatory randomized trial. Are there other outcomes that it benefits? You know, this was essentially like a convenience sample, so we need more rigorous evidence, but there's really good promising initial evidence. That combination, you know, really potent mix, social emotional learning, which we know works, having a trusted adult in your life is a really powerful thing for a young person. Feeling supported by other young people, and being physically active. Put those things together, and that's something that could be a really powerful cocktail for improved mental health. I'm going to finish on a quote. Oh, and there they did a kind of wider extrapolation of, you know, what the overall programme has generated. So they estimate over £5.5 million in 1 year of implementation in wellbeing benefits. I'm going to finish on a quote, if it comes up. So this is on the strapline of my email signature, and it epitomizes for me why we need to be doing this. So Frederick Douglass was a freed slave back in the 1800s in the States. He became a kind of civil rights social campaigner. And he talked about it's easier to build strong children than to repair broken men. And I think that epitomizes why we need to be paying attention to young people's well-being, why we need to be acting now, because what's happening in childhood and adolescence, you know, you see the effects of that throughout the rest of the lifespan. So the earlier that we intervene, the better we can make everybody's lives. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. On. Gosh, I feel like I'm so loud all of a sudden. What I would like to do now is invite our panelists up to the table for all the hard-hitting questions. So I'll kick us off with introducing our panelists, and we'll hear more from Neil. We have joining us tonight Dr. Emily Berger. Hi, Emily is a senior lecturer and educational and developmental psychologist here in the School of Educational Psychology and Counseling. She's an internationally recognized trauma-informed researcher, and her research has informed several school-based programs and policies to support students and families who have been impacted by trauma. We also have Dr. Sophie Lee joining us tonight. Sophie is a counselor, a clinical supervisor, and lecturer here in the School of Educational Psychology and Counseling. Her research looks at the impact and importance of fostering pro-social behaviors in education, focusing on how pro-social behavior can strengthen youth mental health and increase positive life experiences. And she's also an advisory board member for Resilient Youth Australia and the co-founder and research lead of Kind Schools. And we have Ainsley Waters. Ainsley is an assistant principal in a secondary college in Melbourne's southeastern suburbs. She holds qualifications as well in psychotherapy and counseling and has had various well-being related roles within primary and secondary schools, including student counselor, coordinator of programs for students with disabilities, and well-being leader. So we're really, really fortunate to have all of your expertise at the table this evening. Now, we will facilitate a Q&A with our panelists. There is a QR code and a poll for those of you that are joining us online that will give you the opportunity to post any questions and then have an opportunity to view and vote on questions that you would like to see the panelists respond to. So we'll make sure that everybody has the opportunity to scan our QR code. This is part of it will bring you to an app called Slido, which will give you the opportunity to enter votes for questions and whatnot. Do I just leave it here? Okay, cool. I have no idea how this works. But to give you all a moment to think about any questions that you have, I'm going to start with a few questions that I have for the panelists. I know Neil just finished talking, but I want to start with a question for Neil because I am really, really wondering about this. We have some data to suggest that well-being seems to be on the decline, or our students are facing more mental health challenges than before. And it also seems like we have more evidence about what works, how we can support mental health and well-being, and more awareness. Why is mental health and well-being on the decline? What are contributing to that trend?
I think there's not one factor. I think there's a whole range of things. Our awareness has changed. So I think part of it might be not that there are more children necessarily. So the trend that we see actually might be increased awareness. So kids who previously would have gone under the radar are now much more likely to come forward. Childhood's challenging. It's a difficult time in history to be a young person, and particularly, what we've seen over the last 4 years with the pandemic. In England, young people were summarily ignored by the government. Everything was about getting the economy working and getting people back to it, and kids were kind of an afterthought. But even prior to the pandemic, we've had, anything from increased pressure in school, so kids feeling much more pressured, high stakes examinations. There are lots of pressures that we put on kids, and I say we, I don't mean the we kind of are essentially kind of tools of the government policy, if you like, but there's lots of things that are done that increase stress levels for kids that have shifted over time. So I think there's historical shifts that have happened, plus increased awareness. And even though, the stuff that I mentioned about social media, there will be some young people, even though I think the good evidence suggests that time spent on social media is not the devil that we thought it was, for some young people, without the appropriate support, and young people that are particularly vulnerable, for some, that will be a contributory factor as well. So we need, all those things in a really kind of potent mix at a time when it's just a really difficult point in history to be young, basically.
Yeah. I'm wondering maybe if we could pass the mic down to Ainsley. Given that you're working within schools, I'm wondering if you have any perspectives on how well-being and mental health is changing for students that you support, as well as what are schools currently doing? What do you see local schools currently doing to support student well-being?
Yes, certainly. Obviously, I can only talk from my perspective and what I've seen in the schools that I've worked in, so I can't speak for all schools. Look, it's definitely, there's been a huge shift, I would say, in the last 10 years. We've seen a huge culture shift in terms of the ways that students, we support students, and there is recognition at all levels of education of the importance of supporting students in terms of well-being. I think that's been a big change. I can talk a little bit about the programs that we offer in schools. Schools are always very focused on implementing our universal and our preventative programs, such as some examples which would be respectful relationships, which is taught from prep until senior secondary. All of our staff are trained in child safe practices and are certainly aware of the obligations set out to them through the Protect model. There's broad acceptance of the importance of trauma-informed practice, and schools, most school staff, or certainly a number of schools, are training all staff in the Berry Street education model. Among others, depending on the cohort and depending, of course, on what school you're working in, there are anti-bullying programs, cyber safety, sex education, drug and alcohol education. A number of schools are trained in safe schools to ensure schools are safe places for all students, including LGBTIQA+ students, and making sure that they're free from discrimination in the environment as well. So that's sort of the preventative space. Then there are our vulnerable cohorts as well. So schools are doing a huge amount to support wellbeing in, the wellbeing of students. So our more vulnerable cohorts would include students who are funded under the Program for Students with Disabilities and supported with aid support. Obviously, students living in out-of-home care, living in foster care, living in kinship care arrangements, and also in residential care. And Koori students as well. Made sure that those more vulnerable cohorts that we have in schools are given one student support group meeting each term. And along with those come, I guess, the educational plans that are then put in place as a consequence of the discussions we're having with families, with teachers, and I guess other stakeholders as part of a care team for students. So individual education plans, behaviour support plans, attendance plans. Obviously attendance is a hot topic in education at the moment as well. And, we have dedicated student wellbeing teams within schools made up of it depending on where you are. You can have youth workers, social workers, all providing guidance and often short-term intervention counselling. And then, of course, I think Neil was talking about referral as well. That's a big part of their job, referring on when a longer-term intervention is required for student need. The introduction of the mental health practitioner role in school was just invaluable. And a number of schools, there are schools I've worked in that had speech pathologists and occupational therapists who also supported the development and learning of students and were also integral in coming up with educational plans to support their learning, development and social skills within the school. It's really important to point out that schools don't work in isolation in this area. We have our student support services teams from regional student support service teams, and they're often made up of psychologists, social workers, and speech pathologists as well. And they support schools not only with assessments, those cognitive assessments, behavioural assessments, the psychological assessments to support applications for funding for students, but they also support schools with guidance around students presenting with complex needs and behaviours, which we are certainly seeing an increase of in schools at the moment. And they're always there making the first phone call to schools to offer support in terms of our response to critical incidents that can occur in schools. I promise I'm almost finished.
Awesome.
Just want to make sure that, represent what's actually happening. The other group that I'd like to talk about, and a big area that schools work in, is a lot of the unseen work that we're doing in terms of supporting vulnerable students who require more of a welfare response. So breakfast clubs running daily in schools, students being supported with lunches as required. We know that students who come to school without having had breakfast or who are hungry at lunchtime, we know they're not able to attend to their learning. We know they're stressed about what's happening at home and they can't possibly engage in the learning in the way that we need them to be successful unless we intervene and provide just those basic needs for them. And breakfast clubs are really well supported by Food Bank Victoria as well, just incredible. We send, students experiencing food insecurity, we send them home with holiday food packs that sustain them for an entire 2-week period of time. I was working in a primary school during the first lockdown, and we were talking with the integration aid teams, and we were saying, what are we going to do with all this food? And one of them said, well, we've got a bus. We've got a 12-seater bus. So they just went, they loaded up the bus and they delivered it to all of the families that we knew were vulnerable and quite possibly experiencing food insecurity. So, schools are doing some really amazing things in this space. State Schools Relief, we support students with uniform resource assistance. We've had visiting optometrists who give full eye examinations to students, and dentists who offer dental care. This lightens the organisational load of parents as well as the financial one. And really all they need to do is provide consent. Schools are doing a huge amount, certainly to work on building, well and happy kids in our schools. Yeah.
Thank you. No, that's great to hear about all the work that schools are doing. You mentioned, one group of potentially vulnerable students as those students that have been impacted by trauma. And that can happen for a variety of reasons. But Emily, given that your research focuses on trauma and impact of trauma, can you tell us maybe a little bit more about how do we support those kids who are coming to school experiencing adversity and trauma in their lives? Like, do we need to do something different? Are there similar programs and principles?
No, I think we can take comfort in there's very similar practices and processes, and very similar to what Neil was discussing. And I guess, for a trauma-informed practice approach, it's what you do, but it's the order in which you do them. So the foundation of, I would say, the vast majority of evidence-based trauma-informed practice approaches is relationships. Building positive relationships with young people, between peers, but between young people and teachers, between parents and teachers, so positive relationships. On the next run up, we have, regulation, so supporting a young person's ability to regulate their emotions and their behaviour. And then at that final stage, it's building their competencies. So their competencies might be learning competencies, which is why trauma-informed practice is such an important approach, because it really dictates that we need relationships. We need to teach regulatory skills before we even start to approach those competencies, problem-solving skills, learning, executive functioning skills. And we know from the discussion that we've had that that's where schools start, but schools actually need to be starting at the relationship level. And I guess with trauma-informed practice as well, we can think about it in response to young people who've experienced trauma, adversity, stresses, drawing on some of Neil's examples as well. But it's also just good practice as well. And I think that links in, Neil was talking about the research showing the intervening positive effect that relationships with teachers, support from parents, support from peers can have on the impact of stress and outcomes for young people. And so, when Neil was talking about that, straight away I thought about post-traumatic growth. And one of the key drivers of post-traumatic growth for a young person that's experienced adversity is support. Support from adults, support from peers, trusting relationships. So again, that core foundation of relationships, trust, support, and then, as I said, moving on to those other layers. But yeah.
Great. One of the things that came up, Neil, in your discussion, as well as Emily, you just mentioned it, is the importance of peer support. And Sophie, I think you're researching exploring this idea of kindness within schools, and the relation between kindness and well-being is really interesting. What do you think that other students can do to support each other?
Great question, Erin. Hi, everybody, and hello to everyone at home listening in tonight. Enacting specific pro-social behaviours such as kindness and gratitude has a dual impact for us. Firstly, an impact positively on our own individual selves, but of course it has an impact on others' well-being. And Kind Schools, which has been running for a couple of years now, it's a not-for-profit, and we created Kind Schools as a way of supporting schools in thinking more about the impact of pro-social behaviours and being able to promote and support schools in being able to facilitate meaningful projects in the school space, student-led projects that can spread and sow the seeds of kindness particularly. The other side of that is that the 500 schools so far that we've been working with have been very generous in also allowing us to research in this space. And we've really wanted to come back to looking at kindness and the focus of pro-social behaviours with a social-emotional approach to education across primary, secondary and also specialist settings. We've so far collected data from 10,000 students, and what we have learned from these young people is that they consider acting kindly and receiving kindness as being very important, particularly for their experiences of belonging, their functional and healthy relationships, as an antidote to lived experience of bullying. And also they see these behaviours as supporting and bolstering their resiliency and also continuing to give them a sense of hope about themselves and the world. Our young people have also told us that enacting kindness usually happens because they have experienced it themselves. And it really has been valuing and benefiting their mental health and well-being. And so equally, our young people have said that when they receive unexpected acts of kindness and generosity, they're uplifted by this, and then they pay it forward. So in other words, kindness does promote further kindness. So we're seeing in our research that for schools, it's important that we provide our students with that psychoeducation around pro-social behaviours. And what are pro-social behaviours? The types of pro-social behaviours that we value in our societies. We need to think about it from an inclusive and cultural perspective as well. And that our Kind Schools model emphasises what we're calling the 3 pro-social pillars, which are connection to self, each other and our world, compassion, empathy, and courage. So again, thinking about the idea of being inclusive, active bystandering, helping make sure that students are seen and heard by other students and understood on that individual level, and building that sense of connection with one another. Practically, as educators and caregivers, it's really important to model pro-social behaviours. You know, our young people need to see them being demonstrated. And as well as modelling pro-social behaviours, we also need to be able to acknowledge to our young people when we witness them enacting in these behaviours, because that will motivate students to keep demonstrating care towards one another. It sounds a little idealistic, and I think, again, one of the things that we've been really bolstered by in speaking and working with young people over the last few years is that they place such value on this themselves. However, one caveat here is that it's important to note that when it comes to actioning experiences of kindness, that these shouldn't be forced or over-curated. Kindness, ideally, we want it to be intrinsically motivated. So students initiating and leading acts of kindness have a greater impact. And schools, we know, are the perfect places to champion these opportunities. We want schools and we want to support schools in providing resources and time for students to lead passion projects and initiatives that allow them to support their causes and build collaborations with one another. And our overall quest for this research is that we want all of our students to experience kindness as a thread of goodness that underpins the rest of their lives.
Great, thanks, Sophie. I think one thing that you talked about was pro-social behaviors and the importance of perhaps teaching, modeling, and richly reinforcing pro-social behavior within schools. And I think that relates to kind of our top question on the board here, which is about the current debates about the notion of returning to a control and compliance model of traditional discipline within schools. I guess the question is around, well, what evidence exists for going back to more of these old school models of discipline versus where do we go forward with our approaches to supporting well-being that could potentially also improve student behavior, like the pro-social behaviors that you mentioned. I guess the question is where do we go? What are your thoughts on all of that? If anyone would like to take that one.
I'll just jump in just really quickly because I'll sort of speak to this from the perspective of kids exposed to trauma and adversity. I mean, all of the evidence and just our knowledge of trauma and the impact that trauma has on people, not even just children, but has on people, removing a sense of control and choice and power is extremely, extremely damaging for people who have had control and choice and power removed through no fault of their own because they've been exposed to adversity. So it definitely doesn't comply with our understanding of the impact of trauma, how we should respond in an effective way to trauma, and obviously the growing evidence base around trauma-informed practice as well. So I would say for that particular cohort, these sorts of conversations, we need to be very, very careful, because they can be very dangerous and damaging.
I guess, Neil, coming back over to you, similarly, are there any programs or projects or research that you're aware of that has looked at the relation between well-being and either pro-social behavior or, on the flip side, challenging and disruptive behavior within schools, and how those are linked?
So there's sort of not intervention research necessarily, but kind of developmental stuff looking at how these things interconnect over time. And we've published a couple of studies using these developmental cascade models that look at kind of interconnections in development as children grow older. And we do see, connections between young people's behaviour and their later mental health. We see connections between the support that they give and receive, and how that can impact their well-being. So all the stuff around the kind of kind schools, we know that kind of the act of giving, whether that's being kind to somebody or whether it's kind of that idea of paying it forward, that's, if you look at like the 5 ways to well-being model, it's one of the 5. So we know, intuitively, but there's also evidence to suggest that those are good things for us to be doing. And just to kind of circle back to the question on the Slido, the UK is in an interesting place right now with regards to kind of behaviour and discipline in schools. So we've had this trend of, we've been moving towards this kind of model actually for a number of years now. And the most common approach to quote unquote manage behaviour in secondary schools, in England at least, is actually not to try and understand what's causing it, not to try and think about, well, actually, might there be, unidentified trauma that's underpinning it. It's just actually to pull the kids out of the classroom and place them in isolation. So my daughter's secondary school, they used to call it seclusion. So she'd come home and say, such and such was in seclusion today. It's pulling the kids out, putting them basically, if you imagine when you're put in solitary confinement in prison, right, if you imagine doing that to a teenager, at a time in life when social connection is absolutely the most kind of powerful agent for development, and it's removing that, and that's all within that kind of control and compliance model of removing choice, removing agency. What we don't have in England is, and so we're implementing that kind of thing across many, many secondary schools. The worrying thing is there's actually no evidence around it. So we've got things that have been done in almost every secondary school for which, developmental psychologists that work with adolescents would say, the last thing you want to do is deprive adolescents of social contact. But there's no evidence of what impact this is having on children's well-being. So one of the things we're doing in the Be Well study that I mentioned starting this autumn in the next round of our survey is asking young people about their experiences of disciplinary practices in school, so that we can start to look at longitudinally, for those kids that are being placed in those kind of situations, do we see effects on their mental health later down the line? And also, who are the kids that are most at risk of experiencing those? Because it's going to be the kids from the poorer backgrounds. It's going to be the kids that have experienced adversity. It's the kids that are the most vulnerable and that we would least want those kind of things to happen to.
Yeah.
So I agree, we have to be very, very careful with this kind of swing towards, we just need to do things the way we used to do. Well, we used to hit kids, do we want to, are we going to go back there? Of course not. So this idea that, kids used to behave 50 years ago because we were just sterner with them, that's too simplistic a view in my we know better,
Great. Does anyone here joining us in person have any questions? Yeah. Oh, good. Got a mic. Coming your way.
Come on my way. Thank you. Great presentation. Thank you, everybody. Do we need a program? Do schools have to have a program around that promotes kindness or well-being? Or is it like, I'm just hearing, Emily, you were saying a lot of it's relational. Like, how do you put that in a program? Does it have to be this manualised program? Or so that's my question.
That's a great question. I think the thing that I would say to that is that we're really mindful at Kind Schools of the complexity of what educators are currently doing in schools, and I think Ainsley has just so articulated so beautifully, you know, the richness of what is actually happening in the school space. And one of the things that, you know, we're discovering from the research that we're doing is that this is about values and school culture, and that specific resourcing, sure, that can be complementary and supportive, but what we need to think about is a more holistic understanding and approach to education. I think we've got to be very respectful of teachers currently, and I think we have to really champion the role that teachers are playing. And I think each of us individually have a responsibility to be doing that in our society. We were talking, a number of us today, and just reflecting again on the pandemic, and here in Melbourne it felt like there was a window of about 3 to 6 months where teachers were respected, and the media was, you know, providing positive commentary around the role teachers were facilitating during the lockdowns here in Melbourne. And all of a sudden it felt like that window just closed. So it's, you know, the kind of bigger answer for me to that question is about respectfulness and making sure that we're championing the expertise that we have in our educators, that they're already doing so much. So how can we, you know, complement and support our young people's values and experiences of, yes, pro-social behaviour, but doing it in a way that's intrinsic and authentic, not necessarily just looking at in an interventionist program orientation.
We have another. Did you want to add anything to that, Ainsley?
I think I will, just in terms of, I think just to add on what Sophie's already said around, I guess teachers are up against it at the moment.
Yeah.
You know, and teacher and staff wellbeing in schools too, because education support staff certainly support the work of teachers in a significant way. You know, we're seeing some, and not every school, of course, again, I can't speak for every school, but the staff shortages are having a really big impact on the workload of teachers. I think their sense of well-being. You know, students are experiencing a revolving door of staff at a time when they most need consistency. You know, Neil was talking about that trusted adult who plays such a big role in every student's, I guess, experience of school. We've got, we're just trying to recruit new teachers and to keep the amazing teachers that we have. And I do, yes, I would agree that the way that we talk about and certainly respect the teaching profession, I think we could do better. Yeah.
I think it's a great point, and Di, I'll come to you in just a second, but I think it relates to the next question from our online attendees as well, which is, you know, we talk about implementing practices, programs, or interventions to support student well-being, but what about the systems? Like, how do we support that sustained implementation, particularly when we do have a workforce that feels overwhelmed and stressed out? What can we do to really support, I guess, everyone within the school to do this work well?
I mean, something that I didn't speak about when I was talking about my area that I work in is, you know, very much focusing on, you know, building whole of school systems, whole of school supports. And so you're looking at, yes, professional development for staff, but ongoing support as well. So, you know, we have tiered approaches for support for students. Why don't we have that for staff as well? So why don't we have coaching? Why don't we have supervision? So we've done a little bit of work around that and building sort of tiered approaches around supporting teachers. So ongoing support, but policies as well. The role of leaders. So the importance of leaders in this work, leaders actually prioritising when a policy is developed around student wellbeing, develop one around staff wellbeing, make sure that they're linked, make sure that they're talking to each other. So making sure that you've got all the different layers of supports, using multi-tiered systems or using, whole of school approaches, community engagement as well. So where are the community supports? Where are the community agencies that are supporting this work? How can we partner with community? Can we do professional development with community? And, imagine that where there was, community agencies where schools were partnering and doing professional development together and supporting each other in this work. So schools are communities, but they're communities within a community. And so I think we need to think about how we coordinate services. And as I said, this is, from a trauma-informed perspective, but this is from a staff wellbeing perspective. This is from a student wellbeing perspective as well.
Great, thank you. Can I steal the mic? I saw your hand.
I was actually going to respond to Andrea. I think there's two parts to Andrea's question and a response to it. So I think that teachers do need an actual program, because if they don't, so for when they're doing universal programs in schools at that bottom level, if they don't, we're expecting them to write new curriculum. So my concern, though, is that there is this constant stream of the next new program. And just listening to Neil's presentation and the recent research he's been doing, and interestingly, you've been basing it on an intervention and a program that was developed in the 80s. We have the same in Australia. We had the friendly schools that then added in the friendly families back in the 90s. The research was done over 3 years in the early 2000s, started with a universal program in schools across Western Australia. Well, not across, I think there are about 30 schools involved, that demonstrated improved academic outcomes, lowered mental health, lower behaviour instances. So there's the answer to question number one. We do have the evidence that that works better. And then they added, just as Emily was talking about then, follow-up 3 years of adding in a community program to both increase supports to teachers and increase supports to families to look at the added benefits, and there were. So we keep coming up with the research that shows us the same things work, but then we want to throw a new program at a school.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's this idea of like the next shiny thing, and that maybe in our quest to improve or introduce new innovations within schools, are we abandoning the most evidence-based practices that we possibly have? Curious, Neil, what you think about that.
I think so. It's a really interesting point, and I think the thing that comes to mind are two things. We talk about initiative overload in England, and it's that idea of that, like, it seems like every 5 minutes there's a new thing that schools are being asked to do, not just in relation to mental health and well-being, but in relation to all aspects of school life. It's this constant churn of we need to keep trying new things, when actually there's been a good evidence base of these kinds of programs and the multi-tiered systems of support. There's no shortage of evidence. One thing that I think that we could do is, in relation to that, is we need to give schools more time to embed these sorts of approaches before they're asked to do the next thing. Secondary schools in particular, not that primary schools have it easy, they don't, but secondary schools in particular are such large, complex organisations. The analogy I always use is they're like ocean liners. It takes a long time for them to turn around, and we can't expect the culture and the climate of a school, primary or secondary, to change overnight. And yet actually that's what we're kind of doing with this kind of constant recycling of, well, there's now this new thing and this new thing. We had back in the kind of early 2000s, the great thing about our previous government was they had a real commitment to this kind of thing. But they were launching a new national strategy every 5 minutes. So we had, right, you're going to do social and emotional learning. Right, you've been doing that for 5 minutes. Now here's another thing called targeted mental health in schools. Just as you're opening the manual for that, here's another thing called Every Child And schools are just bewildered. So we need, there needs to be time and support given for schools to kind of get it right. And to swing back to Andrea's question, I agree. I think the programs that are needed definitely at the start point, because it gives a structure to something that's not always necessarily that well understood, because it's not always included in any depth in kind of teacher training. We need to do more on that front, but it gives a structure to things. But what makes programs effective is not the manual, it's the practices that the manual promotes, and that might be about building relationships, promoting kindness, but the program gives schools a starting point. But an effective program should disappear. You know, over time, it should just become so integral that it's just part of the landscape of the school, and the school will no longer be saying, we do program X or we do program Y. They just do it. It's just part of their custom and practice.
I'm curious if there are any critical components of effective programs that are consistent. For example, you've mentioned the importance of a relationship with an adult, like a strong, trusting relationship with an adult, or teaching, modeling, and richly reinforcing pro-social behavior. I'm just curious, through kind of all of your shared interests, like, do we know what those core components are? Do they vary? Is there a lot of variation between different programs that are available?
I mean, look, I mean, I can only speak from what I've seen and what I've experienced. No, I mean, I think the narrative for me across different areas of wellbeing, the narrative is the same. I mean, I think you've seen this from the presentations tonight as well. Maybe the emphasis is different across programs, or the focus is different across programs, but the core aspects of, I guess, what these programs are trying to do and then how they do them. No, I mean, I see consistency. It's probably just the language that's used, how they're described, and how they're enacted, and how well schools are supported, obviously, as well. Like Neil was saying, how they're actually embedded within schools. And so schools are really focused on, having these programs, but having them really well embedded as well within the daily practices of what they do. But, I mean, that's from my experience. I don't know if others have other experiences.
I'd align with that, Emily. And I think the other thing is just, of course, and this is, again, the researcher in us, but the evidence base behind what's being facilitated and making sure that these programs do have outcomes that we want to have for our young people. The other additional thing that I was reflecting on with that question is in regards to also making sure that our educators are, feeling buoyant and equipped to be able to support and facilitate the programs as they need to be facilitated. I think of that analogy of, being in a possible plane crash and the oxygen comes down, and I would like to see educators prioritising their wellbeing and being encouraged to do so by putting their oxygen mask on first, before, of course, they're supporting and encouraging and teaching the students in their care. So I think, again, one of the components that I look for in evidence-based wellbeing programs is the consideration around the educators implementing those programs.
Yep, I agree completely. I really believe that the programs that are the most successful are the ones that teachers really believe in, and the ones that they've had time to, I guess, be upskilled in, and to practice on their colleagues, and to really just, have that time to buy into the program, first of all. And obviously it does need to be evidence-based. At the moment, unfortunately, we're, due to the teacher shortages and teachers having to cover extra classes, we're seeing like an organisational design change in schools where days can't be used so much for professional development, and those things are being missed a little bit at the moment, just in response to students needing to have a teacher in front of them.
Yeah, it's complex. I think just to finish up, you mentioned, Sophie, I think a good point, which is the importance of having clarity around outcomes. What does a good outcome look like? If we were to implement this program and it worked. What does that mean? What does that look like? And there's a question here about resilience and how building resilience is potentially an important outcome for children. I'm just curious if you've found in your research that resilience is an outcome that's commonly measured. Is it a skill that we teach? Is it an outcome? Is it what is resilience?
Oh, Erin, have we got another 2 hours?
No, sorry, we have like 3 minutes.
Okay, we might have to put aspects of that on hold, I would say, but I think for me, I think about engagement. I think about students, feeling passionate, excited, attached to their learning. I think about connection. I think about, self-efficacy is really important in young people, fostering that belief in themselves about facilitating whatever they need to be facilitating for their own well-being and learning. So there's some of the things that come to mind in regards to outcomes that I would be looking for, of course, sitting in that social, emotional space.
Any other thoughts on outcomes?
I think certainly in terms of if we're talking about resilience, a greater ability to cope with adversity.
Yeah.
Is what we need to see, really, is kids who have the coping strategies to be able to pull themselves up and know that they're going to be okay, even if they're uncomfortable for a bit. So.
Everything that they just said, thank you. What I would add, I suppose, is I like to kind of keep it simple. When you have kids and people say, and what are your hopes? When during the pregnancy, everybody's stock answer is, as long as they're happy and as long as they're healthy, that's good enough for me. And for me, all of that is rooted in, if you've got a child that's healthy and happy and feels like school is a place that they want to be in and that they belong in, everything else flows from there. All the positive academic outcomes, all the kind of positive well-being will flow from children just feeling happy to be in that space. And I think one of the challenges that we've got for all kinds of reasons is, for a lot of young people, school isn't a place where they have those emotions. It's a place where actually they feel really disconnected.
Yeah.
They feel like it's not for them and that they don't belong there. On the resilience question, one of the studies that was on there but I didn't have time to talk about, so I'm a bit of a data nerd, you might have noticed. And we just finished a study where there's this kind of way of quantifying resilience, because resilience is about, effectively how well are we coping with adversity, like you said. Another way of thinking about it is, how well is somebody doing given their circumstances? And we can model that statistically. Like, we can't do everything with the quantitative data, but there's a way of doing that with something called the residuals approach, and it's essentially we can predict somebody's mental health based on their circumstances, and the prediction's not perfect. Some young people will be doing better than expected, others will be doing worse than expected. Those are the vulnerable kids, the kids doing better are the resilient kids. And then we can look at what are the things that predict doing better than expected. And in the study that we did, it was the basic stuff. Being more physically active, that's something that we can change really quite quickly. It was about good relationships with other people. Again, we can act on that. So all of this stuff we've been talking about, these common themes, the key thing and the really promising thing is none of it is rocket science.
Yeah.
Anne Maston, who's the number one person in the resilience research field, talks about this idea of ordinary magic. What supports resilience in children is not extraordinary, it's really basic, ordinary things like good relationships. So there are things that we can act on that can really make a difference.
Yeah. I think one takeaway, one kind of simple distilled takeaway is we need to create schools that kids want to be at rather than run away from. And if kids want to run away from school, we need to figure out why, and then we need to fix it. So please join me in thanking our amazing panelists. That's all we have time for. It has been an amazing opportunity to see you all, to see everyone online, to hear from our panelists, and thank you all for coming. Thank you everyone online for joining us, and we will, see you back here sometime soon, hopefully. Thanks everyone.